Oh, come on. Hello. Come on. There we are. Hey, this is an interview with Matthew Pirkowski, and this is the interview that I wanted to have, or rather, the discussion that I wanted to have about the Patreon situation. We don't actually discuss the Patreon situation specifically so much as the need to start thinking en masse about decentralization of currency, decentralization of the internet, and so on. So this is a wide-ranging conversation with probably one of the most intelligent people I've come across in my year and a half of doing this YouTube thing about technology and about the intersection of technology with humanity and all the different tensions that we are currently navigating and need to keep on thinking about with regards to cryptocurrency, with regards to governance, with regards to freedom of expression, and with regards to how we communicate and treat one another through the medium of these technological communication tubes that we're using so much. So here you go. I take it just from your expertise from your Medium article that you're fairly technologically literate. Is that kind of your industry? You're in that industry?
Yeah, I mean, I have a varied background, but I mean, it's kind of an interesting and winding story. But I did spend about a decade in the tech industry, and doing various aspects of kind of user interface development, coding at deeper algorithmic levels. I worked for Netflix. I worked for a company by the name of HubSpot, helped them kind of rebuild a lot of their infrastructure before they went IPO. But I got interested in coding back at Yale when I was doing research. I have a psychology degree originally, and I was studying specifically evolutionary psychology and behavioral economics, and I was doing some neuroscience research and also some evolutionary modeling. And that's when I first started coding. And then that kind of led, one thing led to another. I was a little bit jaded with academics and decided to go into industry. But then for the past couple of years, I've been independent, and that's opened up a lot of freedom to do more writing. I do some consulting on the side. I have gotten pretty deeply involved in the space of decentralization, or if you want to call it blockchain or crypto or whatever label you'd like to apply.
Yeah.
But that's also allowed for some flexibility. So yeah, it's been a wild ride.
Yeah, these are topics that are very important right now, and they become increasingly important with, as you outline in your article, with just the different behaviors by these big companies and big governments, and how
Hmm.
they are kind of encroaching. Well, I don't know if they're necessarily encroaching because they're already there and they're already seated in our communications and in our digital
Hmm.
lives and stuff. And you raise some pretty
Yeah, it's almost as if there was a dormant virus in the system already, and then it's become activated, right? And that's kind of triggering an immune response, and we're trying to respond to that
hmm,
in various ways, and some of them are more intelligent than others.
hmm. Yeah. Do you see that? Do you take like a personal stand, or is this kind of informed the stand that you want to take? Is this kind of informed by, and I don't mean this negatively, but by self-interest? Do you see that you have something to add to solutions with regards to certain problematic behaviors by these authoritarian I don't even think they're regimes. It's just like an emergent authoritarianism baked
Mhm.
into the way that everything's centralized with our communications and with the internet.
Yeah, yeah. I think, well, maybe I'll split that into two parts. The first is, do I have, does it come from a point of self-interest? And that question goes quite far back in my own history as well. My senior thesis about, I guess, 12 or 11 years ago or so now was on human altruism and basically the neurological, psychological, and economic aspects of human altruism, whether it exists.
Hmm.
Is it possible to have purely altruistic action? What is the relationship to self-interest? And that started this kind of chain of inquiry, and is also involved in a lot of what I'm doing now in terms of, well, how do you actually align our self-interests with, across timeline or across different time horizons. That's oftentimes the biggest problem that
Hmm.
we encounter, especially as collective and collective action, within the frame of collective action, because we have these long-term ideals and these
Yeah.
goals that we're trying to get to, but quite frequently we're always making trade-offs because we have a lot of short-term needs as well, and
Hmm.
it's oftentimes hard to get to the long-term ideals without making short-term sacrifices that aren't obvious in the time
Yeah.
that you're making them. And so how do you connect those two, and how do you allow people to see the trade-offs that are being made constantly? And
Hmm.
so I think that's how we kind of connect this idea of self-interest to this notion of data sovereignty,
Yeah.
because of the fact that we make many sacrifices all the time in kind of a death by a thousand cuts type of style with respect to incrementally placing ourselves or backing ourselves into corners that might be eventually inescapable when it comes to a point where, if you walk down the road far enough where all of your data is owned and all of your data is not in your possession, there is no legal protections around that data, and the models of your own behavior, and as they are held by third parties, are sufficiently powerful to actually understand you well enough to predict and control you,
Hmm.
then it's very difficult to see a pathway out of that within a democratic frame, and you begin falling into very dark authoritarian places, which is why I also, kind of bring in China in that article, because I very much see that as kind of a future template in terms of where we might end up going.
Yeah. What's the thing that China just is implementing now? What's it called again?
So the social credit score,
Yeah. Which is
it's
an
I mean,
algorithm that
yeah,
watches you and then.
the simplest and most powerful way to put it is that it is a manner of tying the political compliance of the citizens into the economic viability of the citizens. So
Mhm.
therefore, you create this kind of perfect loop where, if you say something that is politically unpalatable to the government
Yeah.
on a social media platform, or exercise some speech right, well, they don't have speech rights, but if you exercise speech in a way that is in violation of the centrally defined rubric of state values, then the loop is such a closed system, and every piece of information is so well observed that you can immediately take that violation and map it directly onto all of your economic viability. So, like, perhaps you wake up in the morning and you can't pay your rent, or you can't get on the subway, or you can't buy your lunch, right? And so that's the connection to the financial system. And I've been
Hmm.
really trying to ring this bell for some time, and I now see that, a lot of people are really beginning to make the same connection. For example, Dave Rubin and Jordan Peterson recently. I think Jordan Peterson explicitly, even when he was announcing leaving Patreon, made this reference to China, and the fact that, the social credit score system is very much the endpoint of where we might accidentally go, kind of
Hmm.
instead of China. Whereas they've architected it explicitly and analytically, we might just stumble our way into the same end game. And that's one of the things that I outlined in that essay on data slavery and decentralized emancipation, that I worry a lot about.
These are very complex ideas, and like with
Mhm.
just with Bitcoin or blockchain cryptocurrency, there's a lot of back and forth on the positives and the negatives of it. And I think like one of the main criticisms of cryptocurrency is that 99% of people, which is a made up statistic, have no idea what it is, what it really means, how to even interact with it, and the pluses and minuses of that. So it seems like there needs to be a broad spectrum education about decentralization in order for people to really understand it as a viable alternative, and even see the dangers, the pluses and the minuses of going down that route. And how would we start to enter into that conversation about cryptocurrency, about decentralization for a complete normie, a complete noob? What's the how do we engage
Oh
in that?
man, there are so many pathways in. I One of the other things that I've been writing is a kind of a long form series. It's called Crypto Beyond Capitalism: The Rise
Hmm.
of Digital Valorism.
Hmm.
And it's a four-part series. I'm about to publish the fifth installment, which is actually almost as large as the first four put together. But uh, I think one interesting way of approaching it, and kind of a path I try to take there, the reason I call it digital valorism is because it's this play on the idea of a reintroduction of values, the more complex human values that we all know to be real, into the representational space of money, right?
Okay.
And so, an interesting way to enter a conversation like this with anyone who is not necessarily aware of cryptocurrency is just to have the conversation about, well, what is money? Have you thought about what that thing in your pocket is, or what that symbol represents, what that dollar means?
Hmm.
Most people haven't. I mean, it's an invisible thing. It's as long as it's useful, as long as it can be used predictably to pay your rent or
Hmm.
buy food or pragmatically act within the world, people just tend to take it as a given, as opposed to a technology that humanity has invented across time, and that
Hmm.
has a very specific history. And that history carries with it specific implications and constraints upon our behavior. And that's the story
Yeah.
that I try to tell in that series of essays that I've been writing.
Yeah. It, money, in a sense, is it's based on trust, in a sense,
Precisely.
or at least belief. It's an investment of belief. Like we all, there's this marker, this imaginary marker that we've all kind of agreed has a value. Even people who act in untrustworthy ways, like a thief, still believes in the concept of money. So they're not violating the trust of money. They're just violating everybody else's behavior around
Yeah.
that central currency.
So actually, that's so this fifth installment is actually entirely about trust in money and time, and trying to, I guess we can back our way into this to some extent.
Yeah.
When you think about trust, well, actually, I would like to, instead of backing away, I would like to just outline maybe one concept that's useful to
Okay.
understand before this. So if you think about the origin of money and these symbols that we use, um, in a lot of ways, money is also, it has a lot in common with language. And I say that
Hmm.
because imagine a world when we were hunter gatherers, and we did not have any representations of, we didn't have any monetary representations, and you and I were part of the same tribe. And we therefore have to kind of consider the different types of things that we're capable of communicating to one another, and the maps that we hold about our past, and what we've done, what we've seen, what reality is. So
Hmm.
let's say that you go out on a hunt, and something happens. Let's say that this time you were the one who was able to actually throw the spear that killed the animal that provided the food for the community at that point in time, right? Well, in a small community, everybody knows that that happened, right?
Hmm.
We all are holding the same mental model
Hmm.
of reality across time. But the thing about that is that it's actually somewhat limited, in the sense that for that mental model to be shared, it actually kind of limits our individual freedom, right? We can't
Hmm.
necessarily go off into different worlds and then come back and count on the fact that we can still communicate across time about what happened,
Hmm.
right? And so if you look at the
You have to
emergence
be
of,
there in order for it to be valuable. You have to actually
yeah, yeah,
physically be there. Yeah.
yeah. And so if you look at the origin of money, and you look at the shell trading, or if you look at quipu, which is, a series of knots tied in strings for the
Hmm.
Incas, or you look at the kind of clay representations in Mesopotamia that emerged, you start seeing this way that humanity began to balance the fact that we needed a tool set such that the community could hold a shared representation outside of the individual minds of each community member,
Hmm.
while also allowing each community member to go off and explore the world more broadly and have
Hmm.
a richer individual relationship with reality. And this is kind of the beginning of these monetary systems, and I would
Hmm.
also say language is quite similar.
Hmm.
And I call these kind of like coherence mechanisms, because they allow for a balance of two things. They allow for, and these are two very necessary things, an accurate balance, or a nice balance of collective agency. So the group being able to actually act as a group and solve
Hmm.
problems as a group when necessary, but also individual autonomy. So also still allowing individual freedom when individual freedom is necessary and called for, right? And
Yeah.
then a balance between those two things. And a lot of these technologies, like language and money, I would argue, are actually various manifestations of tools we've created to solve that same constraint problem.
Hmm.
And so, sorry, if you want to.
No, continue.
So that's kind of this initial concept of
Yeah.
coherence, and then I wanted to go take that into trust. And so in this new essay, like actually, kind of what I'm trying to do is map the idea of trust actually onto time, in the sense that something, a hypothesis I put forward is trust is actually the the ability of me to, without any enforcement, um, take for granted the fact that you are representing both your past actions and your future plans accurately, right?
Okay.
that you are not attempting to deceive me, that you're not misrepresenting this. And that's important because of the fact that we each have these perspectives. And in the frame of coherence, remember, what we're trying to do is take all of our unique maps that we're bringing from our own experience and piece them together. So like what Brett Weinstein often says, like all true maps fit together, right?
Hmm.
In a way, that's something that he has said. And in a way, so well, how do we actually stitch them together? And what I'm saying here is that trust is this very powerful underlying mechanism by which we actually allow for us to implicitly stitch all of our maps together and use them collectively without having to pay very high prices to get that benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And so then like, well, then what is integrity, right? So integrity, trust is like a momentary representation of that map across time. And let's say that it is you're representing it truthfully to me. So let's say
could we use an example?
Yeah, that's what I'm just about to do. So
okay.
Let's say that I am sick at home and I can't go get my groceries. And I say, Benjamin, would you please take this $100 and go buy me some groceries so that I can make myself dinner tonight? And you're like, sure, I will do that. And let's say that in the moment, you actually are saying to me that you actually authentically and genuinely plan to do so, right? You actually plan to go into the world, into this possibility space, and then satisfy the agreement that we've made together about possible futures such that I can actually eat. But then you go out into the world and let's say that you're actually walking down the street and you see a shirt in a window that is really, it really resonates with your style. And it really resonates with the fact that perhaps you have a date coming up and you need a new shirt. And there's all these temptations. There's all these other possible futures. And the thing is that while you perhaps were trustworthy in the moment when you made that initial promise to me, now we're entering this domain of, well, are you a person of integrity or not? Yes. And integrity is being able to hold those models across time, despite being attracted to alternative possible paths. Mm-hmm. And so you can look in a lot of ways at money also as a tool for helping us to displace those types of interactions between people into a kind of an objective technology as well, so that we can create contracts around time sequences. And the thing about cryptocurrency is that it actually allows that to be programmable. And it actually allows you to set up all of these different types of time sequences of perhaps if-then statements, and then pair that with computer programs that can observe the world and then take actions automatically, which therefore dramatically reduces the probability that, for example, you're going to go buy that t-shirt. Because let's say that in a world where if you do buy that t-shirt and an oracle sees you buy that t-shirt, it immediately deducts that from your bank account and sends it to me because it knows you violated the contract, right?
Okay. All right. So there is an enforcement. There's some sort of centralized threat of recompense for your actions.
Well, it's a decentralized threat is the interesting thing, because it's not a single actor that is observing and taking that action. So the model of the future that we want to bring about is not necessarily, I mean, it depends on which specific cryptocurrency you're talking about. There's a lot of different competing strategies for executing these things. It's not settled by any means. But in the ideal world, it's not just one computer program observing the things that happen in the world. So let's take an even simpler example. Let's say that we want to do a sports bet, right? And we could create something like a smart contract to execute a sports bet. And so what that would mean is that you and I would effectively put our bet into a piece of code. The terms of our bet would be programmed into a piece of code. That piece of code would be released into the world. Many different agents in the world would see that, right? They would then all understand and also have economic incentives to ensure the validity of that execution. So basically, let's say that the game happens, right? Let's say we're betting on a Niners game. Let's say that the Niners win by 20 points. Well, you have these things called oracles And oracles, it's their entire job to observe reality and just state what happens in a trustworthy
Yeah.
manner,
Yeah.
right? But it's not just one. Let's say that we would have to, in the contract, we would say that 99.9% of oracles have to report the same reality before our contract executes. And we would specify some network that we both trust implicitly. So trust doesn't go away. This is an important thing. And this is a mistake that a lot of people in crypto actually, I claim, make, is that they say trust actually disappears, which I don't think it does. And this is why, right? Because we still have to be willing to take this action. We still have to be willing to trust the decentralized infrastructure, which is I would argue, a better guarantee and is more robust and resilient to the types of political manipulation that we're discussing, or we should probably circle back to eventually. But basically, if enough of those oracles represent a specific state of the world, that specific state of the world will trigger the clauses of the contract automatically, without any third parties, without any lawyers, without any intermediary, right? And then it can automatically trigger a transfer in accordance with the terms of the bet into whichever bank account is necessary or appropriate given the terms of our bet. And all of this can happen without a clearinghouse, without a bookie, without anything in between that's a centralized actor. It's a decentralized network. Now, if you want to take that whole decentralized network and call that a centralized thing, you can say that's between us still. But it's a lot better, I would say. Like the game theory works out a lot better than trusting a single point of failure.
Okay, so I was going to pick apart the word decentralized. It seems like it's more like multi-centralized or polycentral. Like there's a whole bunch of centers that then make like a consensus.
So there's this constant discussion going on between decentralized, distributed, right? What those terms mean exactly. And it really centers on exactly what you're identifying, because and what I would say, and what I have said to some extent on Twitter and other places, is that it really depends on the scale of analysis, right? Like how at what level of the network are you looking at, and are you trying to describe the topology or the connection patterns, right? And depending on when you choose that scale, it might in fact it might look like actually you've zoomed in enough so that there is a center in that specific part of the distributed network. But if you zoom out, that's just one part of this larger mesh, right? And then the question is, to what extent, and this is the constant tension as well with something like Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency, is that to what extent can you keep the natural tendencies towards centralization from turning the whole distributed web of multi-centric interactions into something that is primarily driven by one large hub.
All it would take would be somebody with the sufficient processing power to comprehend that entire mesh work and then unify it somehow. Like it would just be like a constant arms race of computation or even coding power.
In theory, it's possible. But the interesting thing is this is where the relationship between the game theory and the technological possibilities comes into play, because and this is actually one of the most fascinating aspects of design with architectural design with respect to decentralized systems, is the fact that the possibility space of manipulation for the system itself is still there. And there are many failure cases where the network could be taken over by, as you put it, an actor with sufficient computational power and understanding of the behavior of the network. But the interesting thing about this whole world is the fact that there's also an element of human psychology and human incentives that come into play. And so what you see is, for example, in the same way that the framers of the United States Constitution tried to create a separation of powers that had checks and balances, what we see in aspects of decentralized architecture design is trying to not only understand the way that the networks themselves can be manipulated, but also when they start to be manipulated, how does that change the incentives of the other actors in the system so they actually start acting against that person in a way that is sufficiently powerful to tip the scale back in the other direction?
So there's also a decentralization of force, kind of like a Mexican standoff in a way, where it's all interdependent, and when one node of it starts to amass too much power or starts trending toward that amassment of power, the other ones will be incentivized to somehow devalue that person or cut them out, or I guess there
Yeah,
would be just a number of different ways of dealing with that.
precisely. And like if you think of like a Mexican standoff, you know, while it can certainly destabilize in a very volatile manner,
Yeah.
namely like everybody getting shot in the head, um, it is a form of stability, right? And so like obviously you'd want to try to create something that, while it has certain properties of the Mexican standoff, namely that you know, you have this emergent stability that might come from each individual's self-interested
Hmm.
behavior. You also want to avoid the types of failure cases where everybody gets shot in the head.
Yeah.
But
It's
these are not easy design problems by any means. Like this is a whole new order of magnitude in terms of economic infrastructure. We're entering a very new world here, and it's
yeah.
very early days, which is
Yeah.
why it's very silly to look at the news cycles around this and, you know, see people saying, "Oh, crypto is just a fad,"
Yeah.
or "It's already dead," or anything like this. Where, you know, it's like someone saying that double entry accounting was a fad in, you know, in Italy, when, or in yeah, back in kind of, was it 15th century Italy or something like that, when double
Hmm.
entry accounting was coming around. Um, oh, this is just a fad. Well, like it's a technology that
Well,
is a
yeah,
way of
but because it's new, people need to be, or I think people are justified in being doubly wary of getting scammed by it,
oh,
because
100%. Well, I mean,
we're going
something
to
that
have to work out those kinks in real time, and there's going to be a lot of people getting burned in the process
yes,
of working that out. So,
yeah. Well, it's like, think of it like a frontier, right? And, you know,
hmm,
oftentimes the frontier is this domain of the unknown. And in the domain of the unknown, it is extremely difficult to discriminate between those who are authentic, those who are actually pushing the boundaries forward and doing so for reasons, you know, that are, I don't want to say pure, but um, are at
distributing
least,
the benefits.
yeah, that are at least honest, right? What they're saying, their purposes are actually match their underlying intents. And that being
Hmm.
said, they are the minority on the frontier because, you know, like any domain where there's a lot of money to be had, or a lot of opportunity, uh, and nobody really knows what the rubric is for deciding between an authentic actor and a kind of parasitic actor, you're
Yeah.
going to get a lot of parasitic clustering around that space. And, you know, that's actually why 2018 was, you know, in so many ways such a healthy year for crypto,
Hmm.
because you had this mass die off of all of the parasites, right?
Hmm.
In the same way that, like, let's say that an animal has a bunch of fleas, and those fleas like warmth, right? They cluster and they want to actually be on a warm, healthy mammal.
Hmm.
Let's say that that dog um, gets, you know, it's a rainy, cold day and it's almost hypothermic and it almost dies, right?
Hmm.
The fleas scatter. But let's say it doesn't die. All right. Well, now it's actually a much better off dog, right?
Hmm.
Because it
Hmm.
also doesn't have the load of the parasites that it needs to carry, and it has also survived that, you know, kind of that that point at which it was quite vulnerable to the
Yeah.
elements. And so it also has a certain robustness because it's learned lessons about
Well, as
perhaps
long as it
not
didn't
being outside in
experience
the
a
cold, or
yeah, as long as it didn't experience a percentage of brain death, going through that,
certainly, certainly, of course. And that's, you know, that's an interesting question with respect to crypto. Like, has there been atrophy in terms of the actual, have there been people who are solid contributors to this space who have stopped contributing? And the data on the ground seems to be, it seems to be quite positive in this respect. It actually seems to be, 2018 was a great year for builders. 2018 was a great year for the maturation of infrastructure,
Hmm.
and also it was very good because, you know, the signal to noise ratio now in crypto is far better than it was in 2017, especially late 2017, where the signal to noise ratio effectively went to zero. Um,
What would constitute signal and what would constitute noise within crypto?
So those two different categories of actors, the communications they put forward. So the
Okay.
parasitic actors would represent, everything that they say is effectively noise because it can't be trusted, right? And this goes
Yeah.
back to this idea of coherence that I was talking about before,
Yeah.
where if it, or trust in relationship to coherence, if a bunch of people are putting false maps of reality out there, it becomes very different. It becomes very difficult to cluster together an
Mm.
accurate picture where anything is going or what the territory looks like.
Yeah, especially when
And
there's a crisis occurs in the landscape. Let's say there's an earthquake or a volcano occurs. Everybody really needs to use these maps in order to get to safety. And through that crisis, like it's really shown in stark relief which were true and which were false. Which could the great stitching is a crisis
yeah,
or a bottleneck moment.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a forcing function or a selection function in evolutionary
Mm.
frame.
Hmm. So, when is a frontier not a frontier anymore? Isn't there a like a temptation of the law, where if we're just thinking about the Wild West, when was the Wild West no longer the Wild West? When the railroads went through there, when governments were established, or when the threat of force was outsourced to a centralized authority such as the federal government? Like, is the frontier no longer a frontier when the frontier is known or when it is controlled in a predictable manner?
I think it's a bit overdetermined in the sense that there's not just one contributing factor. I think
Okay.
both of the ideas that you're putting forth there have validity, and to some extent, it's a function of I would say underlying the core deepest indicator that you're going to start seeing less of this frontier behavior is actually stability, right? Have you
Okay.
identified stable patterns?
Okay.
And those are kind of self-sustaining, right? Like, um,
Hmm.
are there enough people who are actually using these tools for kind of the entire cycle of their economic reality?
Yeah.
Are we seeing that occur?
Yeah.
Are we seeing
Okay.
people begin to move actual functions of identity into this space? So there are many people in crypto who are working on creating decentralized modes of identification, right? When we and one of those is actually, I think, attempting to try to pair with airports, for example.
Hmm.
And if you see something like that, then you can be very certain that there's going to have to be this underlying connectivity between this new space that
Hmm.
is kind of unconstrained by previous entities like the state and the state itself. And
Hmm.
that's a very controversial topic in crypto because there are many people in this space that are also quite idealistic about entirely transcending the domain of the state, right?
Yeah.
Or entirely stepping outside the realm of the state, which
Yeah.
while we may do that in the very long term, or at least transform what this idea of state means
Yeah.
across the long term horizon of human history,
Yeah.
it seems pretty unlikely to me that states are going away or being completely displaced by this world of crypto. I see it much more as we have a stable grounding in our present reality. And what we're doing is creating a new space of possibility outside it.
Hmm.
And then as that stabilizes and proves itself more capable,
Yeah.
we'll be able to build far better forms of governance within that new possibility space.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and so new voting infrastructure,
Yeah.
new ways of stabilizing our kind of our economic
Hmm.
relationships with reality and with externalities. So
Yeah.
how do we actually understand money in terms of not just this very abstract symbol, but also how do we pair it to the values that we hold and the types of side effects that our economic activity is having in a way
Hmm.
that allows for wealth creation while also reducing the types of negative externalities that we have on our environment, or and by
Hmm.
environment I don't just mean nature, I also mean one another.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, you brought up in your article trying to encode ethics into money, or trying to code. I
mhm,
think even began this conversation with encoding complex uh, human values into these inhuman or human designed systems, which are,
Mm-hmm.
abstract mathematical models and stuff like that. That sounds like it sounds like a science fiction. It sounds like a space where there's a lot of experiment to see what's going to go wrong, what's going to go right, and if it's even possible for these decentralized or these programs to buttress certain values without being exploited by somebody who can, again, comprehend and calculate and then use that to manipulate everybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And I really, what you express in your article about returning to digital sovereignty, returning to the idea of the fundamental unit of human currency is what we can say the human soul or the human individual, right? And having that as central, like that's the involatile unit
Inviolable.
of
Yep.
of the whole system. It's the human
Mm-hmm.
soul, or whatever we want to call that, individuality is the peak. And yet, what I'm trying to get to is that you chart out the development of that idea with relation to governments and to empires and to economic systems, and how economic systems in the past devalued certain humans in order to expand. And those devalued humans are known now as slaves. And those slaves did a bunch of work without consent or recompense, without getting
Mm-hmm.
paid, other than just basic survival on an animal level of that.
Yep.
And how it might be the case that every leap in human society came about through a recognition and a like a forwarding of the idea of what makes a human being. And it seems
Yes.
like to me that if we can, it's not just you're granted the right of being an individual. There has to be paired with certain responsibilities. Like you have to act in a certain manner, and how we police those actions is where the values of authority and freedom are contested. And how do we navigate that space of I guess like the easiest example with cryptocurrencies would be child pornography, or paying an assassin through these things. Don't we want some sort of centralized moral authority searching the network for these things? And how do we make sure that it doesn't overstep the boundaries of what we give it access to?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, and I'm going to try to kind of go back through. There's a few things that your series of ideas and questions bring up. And so I guess I would first say that with respect to this capacity to encapsulate human values in terms of our within our technological infrastructure, I sure hope it's possible to do that in a bottom-up way, because it's going to happen one way or another. If we don't do it, if we're not capable of doing it in a bottom-up way, it is going to be done for us in a top-down way. So I'll give you an example, and I also cite this in this paper. So there's China Citizen Score example, right?
Yeah.
And that's an obvious way of kind of connecting state centralization of values to economic viability, right? Well, another way that is a little bit less initially or less obviously pernicious, but I actually think leads to the same end game, is the notion of UBI. And this is because of the fact that
Universal basic income.
Universal basic income, yeah. Or that kind of family, that way of thinking about how to deal with a set of problems in which it's increasingly difficult for people to be economically viable in a technological economy, and therefore a central entity needs to disperse money to those individuals. Well, the problem with that is, generally speaking, if you do it in an entirely equal manner, you're basically just inflating, right? And the issue with that is that you therefore have to do it in a way that is, you have to disperse this money in a way that is values contingent. You have to actually make a value judgment about how much the different types of behaviors that people are actually demonstrating in the world are worth relative to one another, which then requires some sort of centralized rubric in terms of the value structures that we actually agree to. And in our current frame of government, that would mean that if it was even possible for our two-party system to agree on such a thing, it would be subject to all of the negative aspects of our present system of, I would say, kind of late stage democracy, in which our modes of governance are subject to all sorts of external incentives that have kind of captured our system of governance, our system of democracy. And therefore, you kind of end up in the same place as the Chinese social credit score, where very large centralized entities are effectively determining the value structure of society that is used to mediate the economic viability of any given individual or citizen. And so therefore, I really hope it is possible, and I believe it needs to happen if we are to actually maintain this historical thread, this idea of the transcendent fragment of individual identity and sovereignty, as you put it, the soul. And I could, we can either talk about that in religious language or not. Yeah. Like, I have a perfectly, and this is actually a good transition, I would say that you can define this word soul as actually the concept of all of the ways across time in which your behaviors ramify out through space and time, right? So whatever you think of yourself going through time, and you're creating a wake, and that wake is moving outwards and connecting and impacting everything else in the network around you. And the extent to which your existence has shaped the world, even in the smallest ways, that whole space, that whole pattern across time, consider that your soul, right? Now, that's the structure that is being scooped up by data mining algorithms and reassembled to try to reverse engineer who you are. So they're, in this language, literally trying to steal your soul, right? Yeah. You could look at it that way. And if that is the case, well, what do we need? Well, we actually need some sort of a smart skin around that soul structure, right? So there's a membrane. You need a membrane, a digital membrane around that can mediate, according to your desires, who gets to transact and interact with that pattern, right? And obviously, you're not going to be able to, your information, that's thousands, millions, perhaps eventually billions of points of contact per day. You're not going to mediate that yourself, right? Yeah. And no amount of lawyers is going to do that either. What you're going to need eventually is some sort of artificial intelligent agent that is not owned by a third party, that is part of one of these ideally decentralized and secure networks bound to your own identity, that acts on behalf of your own interests and has a seat at all of the, at the billion different economic tables of negotiations that happen every day in contact with your soul, so to speak, your data soul. And so that's one way of thinking about this. And I think that's the world that we need to move into, because in that world, what we can actually begin to do is determine the way that our value structures, where they align, where they don't align, and ladder that up from the bottom up in a way that is coherent enough to also begin to take the actions, or to be trusted to take the actions that you mentioned in terms of like, how do you solve a problem of something like child pornography in a decentralized world? Well, we haven't ever had a good answer to that, which is why, well, there's two things. First, we haven't had a good answer. We haven't ever created something that is decentralized, that is of sufficient power to answer a question like that. And it's still an open question whether or not we can. But again, that's why I say that it's not entirely necessary that we disabuse ourselves of all modes of centralized governance or centralization, merely that we sufficiently incorporate the decentralized essence of sovereignty into the system in a way that provides a powerful enough counterbalance to the increasingly powerful centrality of the technologized state.
Yeah. The one thing that you made me think of, so there's these companies, let's say Facebook and Google and whatever else. they're watching us constantly, and they're making a list and then trying to reconstruct that list in order to predict certain behaviors, and then,
Yeah.
as you say, manipulate in one way. The more you interact
say
with
manipulate, you could say perhaps serve ads or help you
yeah.
achieve goals, depending on
Yeah.
what frame of reference you to. Yeah.
So the more you interact with Google, the more accurate their shadow or their representation of you is. And then they use that representation to show you more, to show you different things in order to, make money off of you, or in order to sell that representation to another business that will manipulate you or show you different things, or try to get you to vote a certain way. And then they make money off of that. Are you saying that we should move to a place where we own all of our representations of ourselves? And how would that exactly work? Because they're building that. It's like an artist on the street, drawing passersby. I guess the artist on the street has a lot more power, because then they can sell that representation to the business down the street and say, look, I caught this guy looking at this shirt. If you put this shirt another block down, the likelihood of them paying you money for this shirt is going to be upped. So this artist is making a bunch of deals with third parties and stuff, but it still seems like an interesting, just a philosophical concept of like, who owns your representation, who owns your shadow, who owns the imprint that you make in the sand as you walk
well,
through.
I guess there's both the question in terms of the de jure and the de facto. So like, in terms of the legal structures, I think in the short term, it's certainly a positive thing for us to push towards increasing amounts of or increasing numbers of, or not even numbers, more effective policy that does a good job of defining data as an extension of the legal self. Okay. That being said, in terms of this de jure space, I'm not that confident that that's actually going to be effective, or that that's even possible within our current juridical environment or system of governance. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that, because I actually don't place much faith in it. What's more interesting to me is the way that technologies can help shape the de facto reality of that identity. And so you ask about these companies and who owns the data, and aren't we actually effectively just renters in their lands? And that's exactly true. What we actually have, and this is in my most recent YouTube video, which was a little off the cuff, not that well articulated, but I attempt to discuss this idea that we're seeing the same pattern of serfdom reemerge. We're seeing the same pattern of, when we first had agricultural development, we created these sedentary spaces, and those sedentary spaces led to this class of individuals whose labor was effectively not compensated in the way that implied any ownership over the land they were working, right? Okay. And so it was basically this entire renter class living in this space, yet the growth of that central entity in question depended on all of them remaining inside the walls, right? Remaining as a part of that society. And what we've seen is a recapitulation of that same pattern, except it's just been built atop something like a sedentary pattern of kind of attraction to closed platforms online. So we've clustered around things like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, right? And so then we actually become, in a lot of ways, that cash crop. Our identity and our data becomes that cash crop. That sole structure becomes the actual underlying good or product in question. Yeah. And why is this possible? It's possible because of the fact that if you look at the actual architecture of the internet, what's happening is you have companies who are building spaces where they effectively own the infrastructure, and that infrastructure, because it is owned, as soon as you enter into that space, any byproduct of your behavior is produced on their infrastructure, right? The actual information content is being produced and captured either directly on their infrastructure or as part of a network of contracts and code that bring it back into their into their database. And it's actually possible, and multiple decentralized companies are working on a different type of model where you actually have the fundamental reality of the internet, this future possible internet, is one in which every single individual user on that is a sovereign entity, right? Mm-hmm. And there's a singular way, it's not centralized, but there's a singular base layer of this identity. And any third-party provider who wants to build a service on top of that new internet basically does so in a way such that when they're interacting with a user, all of those interactions, all of the data generated requires an exchange, a cryptographic exchange with the identity of that user. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't matter if it's happening on their infrastructure, because you can have a placeholder for the user on their infrastructure, but without the cryptographic exchange that demonstrates consent, they don't get access to meaningful behavioral data. And the fact that consent has been given or continuously given or taken away, that can all be tracked in a durable cryptographic manner that can't be changed or mutated across time. And therefore, you can actually understand who's being a responsible actor, whether or not people violated your contracts. So like I was saying, if you had that digital membrane around you, if somebody tried to violate that, you could prove that with the technology of cryptography. And I'm not saying that we understand exactly how to, like, what I'm talking about is beyond the possibility space of decentralized technology right now. Yeah. But I think this is where things are headed. This is where we're ideally trying to go, because without that infrastructure, we are very much in a space where the game theory predicts that we're going to end up in this point of technological authoritarianism.
Yeah. So what are things, like small things that people can do right now in order to weaken the existing structure and start tithing to possible structures, possible just reinventions of the internet? It seems like basically you just said that the internet needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, from the protocol upward. How can we start to forward
so that? A lot of that, and a lot of that is happening. So I would definitely, there are multiple projects who are working on these types of things. One that's really interesting to me is Holochain, which is actually building a protocol that's based on a deep understanding of the way that the biological world works. And I think people, if you're interested in technology, going and finding these projects that are unique and or interesting, and at least researching, becoming aware, contributing some of your time, energy. If you're just kind of a layman, at least become aware and literate in this space. Just do a little bit of research, start familiarizing yourself, start with the basics, start with Bitcoin, start with Ethereum, start with understanding the basic idea of a decentralized ledger, decentralized cryptographic ledger. Putting some, and even if you don't want to do that, I would say put your money where your mouth is. Like, start investing in some of these safer mediums of, you can kind of look at an investment as a small, because I like to think of Bitcoin as you could kind of think of it as the sun of the decentralized world. I think it's at the center of that entire ecosystem. And everything, I think the entire decentralized ecosystem right now kind of depends on the existence of Bitcoin. And to the extent that people move into that space, what they're doing is increasing the amount of energy that's at the center of that whole ecosystem, the amount of sunlight that's available for all of the different life forms that are trying to experiment with these new technologies to grow. And so, obviously it doesn't have to be everything. It should probably be only what you could afford to lose, and probably even less than that. But signaling, because all of the markets are all about signaling, right? And not just signaling in a fickle way where you're trying to just make short-term money. Like, I've been invested in Bitcoin and multiple other cryptos, not really IPO type stuff, but infrastructure level stuff for multiple years now. And you see how fickle it can be. You see that people are doing it for the short-term returns. And really what we need more of is people who are willing to put a bet down and just sit there and let it wait for 3, 5, 10 years and accumulate and stabilize. Because like we said, we talked about earlier, the more stable we can make this space, the more we can convince, high quality talent to experiment in this space, build new models that are economically viable. What you're going to see is this growth pattern. And, I think this growth pattern, there's a really interesting concept that people should probably be aware of, something called explosive percolation. It's a recently kind of coined term in network theory. And it's this idea that, when something explodes onto the scene and it looks like it came out of nowhere, what really happened is you had all of these small little networks all over the place that were growing independently, and then they start connecting to each other. And as soon as that starts happening, boom, they pop up into a very visible and undeniable force. And that's what's happening right now. And so all of these little things that you can do, either investing or researching or beginning to code in these spaces, taking a job that perhaps pays slightly less in the immediate future, but provides much longer ROI for humanity in general, along the terms of actually making this world a reality. All these things are useful, and all these things to some extent are a little bit of a sacrifice, but that's really the pattern that's gotten humanity through so many of its difficult times is the willingness to be able to sacrifice in the short term in service of greater long-term goals.
Yeah. Do you think it's reliably predictable that this possibility space will stabilize? Because what's driving it right now is the amount of change that's going on. And the amount of change that humanity has experienced in the last 40 years, just my lifetime, let alone the last 10 years, is astronomical. It's like nothing else that we've experienced before. Will this eventually stop changing so fast that it can be stabilized, or can we reinvent a relationship between stability and innovation that is parsable? Because it doesn't seem like people can trust something that's changing so fast. Will it stop changing eventually?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it really cuts to the heart of what's going on here in terms of the primary force driving so much of what we've talked about today is this explosion of complexity. And that complexity isn't just happening along one track or one dimension, right? It's happening along the financial dimensions. It's happening along scientific research in terms of like biological questions. It's happening economics, politics, like all our own relationship to communication, to each other, digital infrastructure. Like, we're not only speeding up, we're also adding new dimensions of unknowns every single day, which is quite literally stretching us beyond our capacity to stick together, to remain coherent. And we can literally feel this. It feels like we're being pulled in many directions, increasingly incapable of making sense of the fragmentation that's happening all around us. And so what I think is, if we actually do succeed in creating a distributed or decentralized infrastructure that is more capable of representing human value at this next order of complexity, we'll find a balancing point that does feel more stable. It's not going to be, it's never going to entirely stabilize, because as soon as you stabilize, then you create the platform upon which you build new problems.
Yes.
But that's kind of the whole history of humanity. But I do think that without a exponentially more powerful tool set for establishing and maintaining coherent structures that don't force us to oversimplify, like that's one of the biggest problems with our political world right now, is that you're operating on a one reality of left and right in an increasingly complex world that no longer projects predictably onto that left-right framework. And so we'll know. I think it's kind of a chicken or the egg problem. It's like, do you start to, do we have to continuously, do we have to kind of go through a point in time where it feels even less stable before we can actually reach a point in time where it's more stable? I think the answer to that might quite reasonably be yes, especially with respect to our systems of governance, because I think that's really where the instability is being injected into the system, and within our own domestic politics, but then increasingly also at the geopolitical scale.
Yeah.
Obviously, China and the United States right now um, is once again entering the consciousness of the average citizen in terms of what that means through the trade war. But there's
Mm.
many more layers to that question than most people have really dug into, and
Mm.
I would also suggest that people look into that. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah,
Do you think that? Okay, this is kind of this is a little self-serving because this is my domain. I want to bring it into my domain, but
yeah.
it's something that you outline in your piece, and perhaps how we stumbled across each other. Do you think that there are certain value sets that are being experimented with right now in the very black and white, left and right, but more interesting, the rise of individualism or classic liberalism or the attempted rise of that versus the rise of, let's say, something on the right with, well, the right and the left and their identity politic, whether it's intersectional or ethnographic nationalism. Do you think that those three or two sets of competing value systems are ways for individuals um, to navigate the amount of change that's going on? And one way of navigating that would be hyper-progressivism, where everybody is ordered according to, let's say, privilege and oppression axes, and then we order the social capital by means of that rubric, or the traditional set where everybody who can play with these people has to agree with a certain value set and maybe has to align to certain ethnographic behaviors or just identities, historical identities. And then the classic liberal IDW, that weird kind of thing that I don't know if it's going to survive or not, but it seems like that's the one that's under attack from all sides, the authoritarians and then the progressives and the ethnostate, like the centrists, who, I don't want to champion Sargon of Akkad, but he kind of turned into the Flashpoint, at least with how he was treated by Patreon, and he's kind of like an individualist. And I wonder if it's possible for that individualism to navigate in a sufficiently simple form to be communicated and a sufficiently flexible form to deal with complexity. And I don't know if I'm stating this question correctly, but when we return to that idea of the soul, the transcendent individual, and we start to try to form a community or collective that champions and prizes that, is there a way for that to survive any attack or guard itself from attack from the left to the right, and then that thing above, that oligarchy or authority above?
I think I'm tracking what you're saying. Let me just perhaps try to
Yeah.
restate that, just so that I do know that we are kind of on the same resonance with this idea before I provide any answers. So I think what you're asking is that we're seeing, in response to this increasing complexity, we are seeing different hypotheses arise on the traditional left and the traditional right, kind of in the form of actually going much more extreme, or doubling down on past ideologies in a far more extreme manner, hoping that is going to somehow alleviate or kind of satisfy this increasingly chaotic world that they're seeing. So it's like people on the far right are looking at the complexity that's increasing and blaming it on their worst projection of those on the left, like the straw man of those on the left, and then doubling down on the most extreme aspects of their ideology, which would be something perhaps along the lines of ethno-nationalism, in terms of really doubling down around
cluster
certain
of
aspects
uniformity.
certain aspects of identity that are perhaps more homogenous, right?
Yeah.
Or more proximate, might be a better way of thinking about it, that are like, here's myself and my community and my family and my nation, and I'm going to hunker down in response to the complexity, right? And I'm going to double down on that structure, and then I'm going to be very adamant about reinforcing the defense mechanisms and the walls, and put guns on the walls and put walls on the guns and guns on those walls, right? And then on the other side, you have the idea, where you have looking across the other side and saying, oh, it's effectively all of the hatred in the walls and the guns that are creating the complexity, as opposed to understanding that actually the walls and the guns are just a response to the same larger world of increasing complexity.
Yeah.
So they were kind of blaming it on that, and then saying, well, what we actually need is just this extreme form of acceptance that actually, ironically, to be in any way workable in the real world, requires an equally strange and rigid hierarchy of values. Yeah. And then they're trying to imply, force that on the world. And so you have these two crazy poles. But then I think what we're seeing with the intellectual dark web, and or whatever, the so-called intellectual dark web is, I guess, the kind of the way that it's referred to. I think what you're actually seeing is, that tension is actually, there's this concept that I really like called, generative tension, right? So actually, oftentimes when a system is in tension, it gives rise to something outside of itself. Like you can think of it like if it's tearing apart and pieces are flying off, but then there's something outside the system catching those pieces and reassembling them into something that's more capable, that has a higher capacity, that has a higher degree of not only potential, but also it can reflect back on everything that's happening inside of it, right?
Yes.
And it's also, think of it like a sphere outside that one dimension. And that's why you have people in the IDW that could be along all different sorts of kind of traditional political lines of thought, but they're all kind of in this world where they recognize the need to create a container outside the current space that is capable of holding that space together, analyzing it, and potentially reconfiguring it in a more sustainable way across time in this period of destabilization. And I think that's really what the IDW is trying to play. And then to your question, manifest. Is it, or manifest, in the question, is it possible? I sure hope it's possible. I think it's possible. And I think that I think that it's successful possibility, or the versions of the IDW that I see succeeding in their goals in the grandest sense, I see them dovetailing almost invariably with this space of decentralization, which you can also see now in the aftermath of the Patreon situation. Yes. They're beginning to talk about crypto, which is interesting, right? It's like you're seeing these two worlds collide, and for me, it's really something else, because these are two worlds that I'm very deeply steeped in, and seeing them collide and come together is quite hopeful.
Yeah, it just the problem with that, what you're describing, the sphere outside of that binary. That elicits the mistrust and outright hatred of those two extremes and the very powerful entity that is benefiting from the destabilization that's given rise by those two extremes, which would be any sort of conglomerate. I really think that what we saw with Patreon is not Patreon's terms of service going willy-nilly. It's that there's a bigger entity behind Patreon saying, no, we're going to kick that guy off, we're going to kick this guy off, we're going to kick this guy off, because they are destabilizing the destabilization, maybe.
Because that's exactly right. I mean, if you are an entity that has been powerful enough, or has become powerful enough, and has the resources to both understand and to some extent control that one-dimensional game and how it's being played, the last thing you want is for that to become unpredictable or uncontrollable, because oftentimes as soon as you start building your business or building assumptions about what to do over the next quarter or the next year or the next 5 years, and you invest, let's say you're Apple and you're Tim Cook, and you get up there and start talking about how it's effectively a sin to not do this, you're making these huge bets on your capacity to predict the behavior of the system. And therefore, anything that appears as a unpredictable element of the system needs to be effectively whacked down. But, the question becomes, and I think the potential in really building effective and robust decentralized systems is you force these centralized actors to play a game of whack-a-mole that is so tiring and so diverse along so many dimensions that they are drained of their resources and eventually superseded by a new paradigm. And that's a similar idea of, in terms of the United States strategy that we took in the Cold War with respect to Russia and or the USSR, and effectively forcing them or stressing them along as many dimensions as possible, such that they eventually collapsed or started making bad decisions. And I think that we are, like, game theoretically in a very similar position where we're trying to figure out how to establish a very resilient guerrilla strategy that is, and the fundamental, the axiomatic necessity of that resilience is financial viability.
Yes.
Right. And that's exactly why I think, people in IDW are being told right now that you need to do this around something like crypto, because you cannot place you cannot place a bet this big on something or on a system whose incentives are so obviously skewed against your long-term goals.
Yeah. So what individual participants in this sphere that's outside of the binary, just because I want to avoid the IDW as a name, but like whatever.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the things that we can do.
Do you look at or have you read any do you watch any of Rebellism stuff?
Yeah.
Rebellism? Yeah. So they also talk. They've been doing more around integral theory. Or
Weber.
Have you ever heard of this, or spiral dynamics, or integral with SDI with Ken Wilber? I don't think any of these theories, I don't think any of them are the reality, but I think they're useful heuristics, especially the spiral dynamics side of things. I think Wilber goes very, very far into the esoteric, and can be a little bit of a turnoff to those who are more analytically or materialistically minded. But you actually look at the origins of the spiral dynamics side of things. So there's Claire Graves was a psychologist who was a contemporary and a friend of Maslow. Maslow created a very simple representation of human needs in development based on a hierarchy, a pyramid, right?
Yeah.
But Claire Graves's model was actually a really interesting double helical pattern, where he posited that there were two poles of the individual and the collective, and that society kind of went back and forth between these two poles, where when it moved towards collectively focused or self-sacrifice focus, it was able to solve the previous problems of self-interest, but it also generated a new set of problems that could only be solved or approached by a higher level of self-interested center of gravity. So you kind of go back and forth, and you end up kind of spiraling, right? That's the fundamental idea there. But then there's also this idea where in that theory, there's these first layers of kind of history that you kind of go these 6 steps. And then that's like the core tier 1 of this system. It's the inside of it. And within each one of those layers, the people who are acting in that world or in that frame of reference believe that their layer is effectively right or the only way to see the world.
Yes.
But then you kind of make this jump out to this second tier, and you actually then start reflecting back upon all of the potential values that each of those layers has, and the potential need for all of them as an integrated whole, as an integrated structure.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about the predictions that are made in that jump, at least to me as just kind of an observer of this stuff over time, is that a lot of those predictions about that tier 1, tier 2 jump look a lot like the patterns that the IDW is coming into, in terms of a refocus on not just the individual, but the integrated individual who can step outside of ideological frames and integrate many perspectives into a higher order understanding of a complex reality. Many other things as well, but so I don't know, maybe there's some seed. I don't necessarily want to kind of bring the dogma of these ideas into the conversation, but it might help to reframe things outside of the IDW lens as well.
Yeah.
This kind of entering this tier 2 world. I kind of look at the IDW as like the initial, you could look at them as like the forward reconnaissance team, or you could look at them as like, if you want to use biological lenses, as like scaffold proteins, something like that, going out into this new space and building the initial structure that later waves will eventually kind of
Yeah.
inhabit or flesh out.
Yeah. And so the question is, how does somebody who's embarking on this uh, journey as a content creator, as a writer, as a thinker, anything like that, producing content that might draw the ire of the extremists and the authoritarian, or the oligarchy or whatever. How do we form financial viability outside of that system without provoking the system just enough to show its weaknesses, but also not enough to get a backlash and get kicked out of the game entirely. Like I don't want to be paranoid, but it seems like I should be paranoid that at some point they're going to come after me. So
Yeah.
what are the steps that I need to take to be protected against that? Do I just start inviting people to join me in a decentralized realm, whether it be like a video hosting service and or a cryptocurrency service? Is that the way that I do it?
I mean, I think, and over the last year, I've spoken with many people who are beginning this process of how do we develop kind of emergent communities that are capable of self-sustaining economy and also of this kind of values aligned. Because right now, okay, let's say we have the Patreon model, right? We've just demonstrated the case that the Patreon model is insufficient to mediate this kind of peer-to-peer values aligned experimental economy. So we know that's not a viable solution now. So then what are these viable solutions? And I don't think it's just, I think it has to be more than just technology. It actually has to be finding a way for us to stitch together communities, like coherent communities, turning these videos and these conversations into economic networks where we increasingly add new pieces of, because an economy requires, let's say a town. Let's go all the way back to a town, 500 years ago. You need your cobbler. You need somebody to grow the food. You need somebody to make the clothes. You need somebody, you need all of these different, to have a full, there's a concept that I like called the minimum viable wheel, right? A minimum viable wheel is not 3/4 of a wheel. That doesn't work, right? It doesn't, like, the wheel breaks. You need to understand, and you need to build enough of a structure such that you have a circle, and the circle is strong enough so that it can roll with whatever weight's on top of it. Now you can change the materials and you can innovate on what the wheel looks like. You can invent tires and you can do all sorts of things to the wheel once you get the minimum viable wheel. But like in terms of our economic community and our values oriented community in this new space, this space of scaffolding proteins, or this space of reconnaissance outside of it, we need to create that minimum viable wheel of an economic community where if someone gets fired, that's okay. Come, we can pay you. We can pay you for work, but we do actually need someone who has your skill set. We have use for a designer. We have use for a coder. We have use for an author. We have use for even the more you can create economic viability and uses for a greater number of skills. We have use for scientists. Like, how cool would it be if we actually have use for a particle physicist for some reason, right? Like, who knows? But the more you can create projects, like, I really believe this. We need to have capital. We need to have a self-reinforcing economic engine that takes profits from the various elements that we are creating individually in connection with the previous economy and sucks them into a new space that can be directed to product or projects and products that accelerates that growth together, right? Like that's the world that I want to see. That's what I want to see come out of all of these online connections, all of these ideas that are being seeded by the IDW, and then that kind of catalyzing this moment where we get a minimum viable economic wheel, and then that thing just grows like wildfire,
Yeah. The thing that I was thinking of quite earlier in our conversation about Bitcoin, you use the metaphor of the sun, and I'm thinking like the metaphor of there's the Catholic Church, and then there's all these different Protestant churches, and everybody's like tinkering with the dogma, which would be the code or the way that it's all set up and stuff. And I'm wondering, like, what, I guess we just have to wait and see which one's going to be more viable. What are some of the qualities that attract you to an individual cryptocurrency that you think makes it viable?
Well, I mean,
or trustworthy?
one simple, very, very simple but powerful predictor is something that, while I don't always agree with Nassim Taleb, and think that he can be a little bit abrasive, to say the least, I do think that his constant upregulation or hammering of this idea of the Lindy effect is powerful, right? So
Lindy effect.
if you look at if you look at something and you look at how old something is, you can kind of look at that age as a sort of inertia that helps keep it going. Now,
Okay.
this isn't always true, but it does. I would say it does have a lot to do with the
Staying power.
fundamentals. Yeah, it's a simple way of thinking about. It's a simple heuristic for understanding the more complex network mathematics that are driving a pattern like that.
Hmm.
And so right now, I really do think that you look at something like um, I'm not a huge fan of Ripple just because of the fact that it has such strong affiliations with the present banking system. But I like, I obviously like Bitcoin. I think Ethereum has a lot of network effects going for it right now. I think it's pretty resilient, pretty anti-fragile.
Hmm.
I think Bitcoin is the most anti-fragile of the networks so far. I think it's actually it has reached a minimum viable stability
Hmm.
as a supranational network, which is actually I think that's the
Hmm.
most interesting thing about Bitcoin is that it actually has reached a point where there's enough capital and there's enough of a distribution of its operating infrastructure across enough different sovereign entities
Hmm.
such that it is an anti-fragile supranational economic um, flywheel. You could look at it like that, right?
Or Mexican
Um,
standoff.
yeah, or Mexican standoff. Um, without the getting shot in the head. I think EOS is interesting. It's a more controversial project. I do think that I think the most important aspect of EOS is that what they did was they decoupled. So if you think about Ethereum, I don't know how familiar you are with like the whole IPO wave, but so you create a company, and instead of actually going to an investor, what you do is you do kind of a crowd sale of your token. A bunch of people buy those tokens, right? There's a certain supply of the tokens. The demand for the tokens sets the price of the tokens,
Hmm.
right? But then you're in an interesting position because what you've done is you're using the same thing to fund your company, these tokens, right? The capital that you've generated by way of selling these tokens. But the thing is that the value of the tokens is also the signal of your success to the market, right?
Hmm.
Like in the marketplace, in the same way a stock ticker, right, is kind of like a proxy for the value of a company,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
The If you look at these decentralized exchanges, it's the same thing for these companies that have done an IPO and sold a bunch of coins. They have a price, right?
Hmm.
But the thing is, if you have to sell your coins to pay your employees to actually work, you're to sustain yourself, you're constantly putting downward pressure on your own price
Hmm.
because they're coupled, right?
Hmm.
EOS has figured out a way without getting into or EOS, and others as well. But it's not just EOS, but EOS has kind of introduced a platform where it's actually a different model of what it means to actually um, be a company that uses EOS for building its infrastructure, such that
Hmm.
the way that you're actually uh,
Hmm.
economically incentivizing or paying your own employees or growing is decoupled from the actual coins in the network. And
Hmm.
it's kind of like a these are all global computers, decentralized
Yeah.
global computers,
Huh.
but they're just different ways of conceptualizing how to build a
Yeah.
decentralized global computer.
So you think that all these different variations will eventually give rise to one coin to rule them all that can take the best parts of all of them, or do you think that there all will always be compete? Is there a necessity for competing currencies in the crypto space?
So my general, and this is something that I also go into in this essay series that I talk about, but I really do believe that what we actually want is uh, we want to conserve diversity, some degree of diversity of how we represent value in the system, and we don't want it to converge over time to one because that's effectively what has happened already with our current currency. It converged across long periods of time from a system where humans used all sorts of different ways of representing values that
Yeah.
were or actions that were specifically related to different human values And then the growth of civilization was kind of a forcing function for efficiency and homogeneity that eventually led to one unit of account per nation state, right? And I think we actually don't want that in the upcoming world. What we actually want, we don't want an infinite number of these dimensions. But think about, for example, just to give an example of why this previous pattern occurred of this convergence to one unit of account. Think about 500 years ago, trying to go into a marketplace with 20 different types of coins representing 20 different values, and having whatever merchant try to run a complex system based on that many units of account, and it's just going to fall apart. It's not going to work, right? Yeah. But today we live in a world where, in this device right here, I can own, as many cryptocurrencies as I want, and they're almost entirely fungible, and they effectively impose very little overhead or transaction costs on anybody who would want to, accept or use various types of cryptocurrency. So I think we actually are entering a space where you're going to see something like, buckets of different currencies, meta currencies representing different types of values. Like, I think it's actually an interesting solution to things like the polarization that we see right now. Imagine if you have Democrat coin and Republican coin. I'm not saying that that's reality, right? I'm not saying we should actually do that, but I'm just as a conceptual exercise, think about this, right? So right now, actually, the economic model between Republicans and Democrats is quite interesting because of the fact that you actually have every incentive to, from a perspective of a politician or a party, you have an incentive to polarize the audience, because if you polarize the audience, then it's far cheaper to know who you need to pander to, and you can, more efficiently do that. And so over time, as that cycle plays out, it just drives the polarization and it amplifies that. Yeah. Now, if you actually let's say that we introduce a marketplace
intellectual dark coin.
Yeah, but let's say that we have we'll stick with Democratic and Republican coin for now. Let's say that you hold Democrat coin and I hold Republican coin, and I'm a shop owner, and I'm not going to refuse you, but let's say that I can actually charge different prices based on values alignment, right? So basically, there's, simultaneously, you probably want to get cheaper prices if I'm the only person who has the good that you want, and therefore at the end of the month, when you look at what your ideals are costing you, you might reconsider them. But simultaneously, if I am driving you away as a customer because I am holding ideals that are not in conformance with yours either, therefore I'm going to reconsider the fact, do I really believe strongly enough in this to kind of keep that price or keep that skew? Now, people can certainly be idealistic and shut people out, and we already have issues with people rejecting service for all sorts of reasons. But what about a world where you don't reject service, but pricing is just marginally different, and you actually see what your values cost you in a menu at the end of each month? You actually create an attraction between all of these values. You create a way that you align financial incentive with actually constantly trying to hash out the difference in perspectives.
Yeah, that's interesting. Once you scale that up to a religion level, if there's Christian coin and Islam coin, depending on how fundamental that Islam coin, there might be different coins within the Islam coin. It might be the case that the most fundamental value structure is coherent enough to create a mass that can just bowl over everybody else. And
maybe. Well, because but think about it like a fractal, right? Instead of Islam coin, let's say that you have a basket of value type, or you have a basket of value oriented coins that represent something like Islam, and you have a basket of value-oriented coins that represent something like Christianity. And the interesting thing about that is, look at each coin is effectively a dimension of value, of a actually held value. You immediately see where there's overlap. You have a tool to actually say, hey, look, these are all the things that we actually agree on. Now there's these 3 or 4 dimensions that don't agree, and there's therefore a price tension there. But we can now actually have a conversation at a higher granularity level, which is something that, for example, people like Peterson have been talking about for a while, in terms of the fact that most of the issues that we have in the current way that we're discussing them are intractable because we're talking about them at a resolution that is just far too low. Right.
So
So how
we
do we
need
have
to,
how do we create tools to have higher granularity conversations, have higher granularity maps of the world, to be
yeah.
able to see these things in a way that actually allows us to speak to the better angels of our nature, as people like Pinker, as someone like Pinker would say.
Yeah, yeah. And that would have to do with certain ground rules that would play out as more viable than other ground rules. Like if I, let's just take my channel. If I'm able to talk to people from all over the experiential map, all over the political map, there will be something that I am able to bring into every given instance of conversation, which would be the exchange of value, which is creating something of value to the listener, right? But if I'm
Yes.
speaking to somebody who is, let's just say a contemporary example for me, somebody who is a trans rights activist, and then somebody who is a gender critical feminist, their values are in tension, but there's something of value that I prove as valuable by speaking reasonably with one person and reasonably with the other, and modeling not necessarily them coming together, but I'm showing that there is a bridge between them somewhere. I don't know what it would be, and just like
Yeah.
my listening style or curiosity or some fundamental unit of discussion that then it starts to replicate itself as valuable, because it proves its viability in creating more and more interesting, valuable conversations. Does that?
100%. I think this really ties deeply into this idea of coherence that I was talking about earlier, because really what coherence represents as this tension between collective agency and individual autonomy
Hmm.
is the ability for us to find ways of exposing the parts of ourselves to each other that actually align, right? Which is a difficult, which is a difficult task,
Hmm.
because, like, for example, and especially online, when you don't have all of um, the evolved human psychology of interpersonal relationships,
Hmm.
and like seeing your facial structure, seeing your expressions, hearing your intonations in your voice,
Yeah.
having my mirror neurons actually firing when I'm seeing you, like all of these things add
Yeah.
up to a much different mode of communication, where
Yeah.
we're more likely to seek those parts of ourselves that line up than we
Hmm.
are where we're online, and we have perhaps different goals or motivations, and it's happening in a very tense environment. We're doing it very quickly.
Yeah.
Our threat systems are activated, and like what does that do? Well, that orients the two people in a way where they're obviously not going to line up.
Yeah.
And if you think about just the way that humans are, like if you say, oh, humans are multifaceted, it's like that's, well, yeah, duh. Like everyone would kind of agree with that. Like, yeah, we're all complex. We have different perspectives. We're multifaceted entities. But then the question is like, well, okay, given that we all have these different perspectives, and we all can bring different parts of ourselves to the table at any
Hmm.
given moment, what actually determines, or what are the set of determinants that actually either bring those parts of you that are seeking to align with others, or that bring those parts of you that are seeking to conflict with others?
Hmm.
And that's an interesting question. And I think, like, to the extent that we can create tools that help us figure out how to bring those parts of ourselves to the table that are actually
Hmm.
seeking to align and figure out
Hmm.
ways of communicating value
Hmm.
um, constructively, we're going
Yeah.
to build a much more stable and
Hmm.
stable and flourishing world for humanity. And I'm
Hmm.
not saying it's utopian. We're never going to get rid of conflict, but even
Yeah.
if we can move that needle, right? Like, and I'm kind of, what I'm also saying is that I think we're in a place where if we don't actually move that needle, we're going to go to some very dark spaces
Yeah.
as a species in the next
Yeah.
50 years.
Yeah. We need to incentivize generative conflict, basically.
Yeah, that
And
generative
I think
tension, right?
generative tension, and I think one of the most offending parts of censorship is that it cuts out the ability for that completely. It doesn't actually take the required complex steps to force or incentivize generative tension. It just cuts the tension out by pushing
Yeah,
actors out. And that completely violates and doesn't do anything. It doesn't solve the tension at all. It just pushes it somewhere that's not seen, and then makes the system blind to it, and forces kind of like a black swan event eventually.
yeah. Because new
from the
states they have to emerge organically, right? They have to come out of the actual real world interactions of individuals. They can't be analytically derived by a
hmm,
group of researchers in the heart of Google and applied top down upon
mm,
society. I mean, they can be, and that's what they're trying to do right now.
yeah.
But anyone who knows anything about the way that complex systems work understands that you're going to, by doing that, impose a vast amount of unpredictable side effects on that system that might just make everything more turbulent and chaotic. And I think, that's what's happening. That's what we're
Hmm,
seeing.
hmm, hmm. And so we
So
kind
we
of,
need we need better tools for that
yeah,
emergent sense making and
yeah,
coherence, and
yeah.
make that visible, and to make that more powerful, and to formally incorporate that to our corporate and our political world.
Yeah, good luck to us, right?
Hey, I honestly think these things can happen more rapidly than people they can happen more rapidly than is obvious at a point in time before it has happened,
Hmm,
because of the fact that if you get a pattern, like if a pattern works, like if you actually get that minimum viable wheel, it can take on a life of its own, and it can infect things
hmm.
pretty rapidly. So you know again, I'm gonna try to be hopeful, because if I'm not hopeful about it, then it's much harder to work towards it, and
Yeah,
to achieve it, or to have any chance of achieving it, is going to require working towards it.
yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matthew. I'm gonna wrap up this conversation here. I think we covered
Yeah,
enough ground for one
yeah,
discussion.
we did. It was a great conversation. I really appreciate you having me on, Benjamin.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks.
and if you ever want to talk in the future about any of this stuff, I would love to continue the conversation.
For certain. You have a YouTube channel then?
Yeah, I do. It's just my name, Matthew Perkowski. I'm going to be making more videos on that. It's a
Great.
2019 goal of mine. I have a huge backlog of ideas and notes that I want to get
Excellent.
out there. So more videos. I have a Twitter. It's at Matt Perkowski. And then also all of my writing that I've been mentioning is on Medium, also under my name, Matthew Perkowski.
Great. I will link to all the things.